Hi there, and today we're going to do your first scene in Blender. It's going to be an easy one to do, but first of all we need to start off not in Blender. We need to start off in Google because we're going to look for some images. Now the first thing you want is a background. Now a reasonable background to use might be something in nature. It depends on what you want your scene to look like. But here I'm going to have as a background, I'm going to use a picture of a laboratory. So I'm just going to bung laboratory into Google and go to images, and under search tools I'm going to make sure that we've got large size, and I'm going to pick something that looks good. So what do we got that looks like it would be good as a background? Here's quite a complicated picture. We'll use that one, view image, and we'll save the image to the tutorial directory I just set up, and we'll just call it lab. So say what you use is up to you. I mean, you could make it an outdoors scene, it doesn't really matter. Okay, and the other thing you'll want is a picture of you or your girlfriend or your pet, because this is going to be kind of a picture view but with a twist. Okay, so make sure you've got that, and finally we want some kind of texture for a floor, and quite a good way of finding this sort of thing is to bung in floor texture into Google Images, and we'll see what we've got. And some of these are going to be tileable, which means you can stack them up in X and Y. Like this one, for example, looks tileable, whereas that one obviously is probably not. Tileable tiles, who would have thought it? This one, for example, wouldn't be tileable. This one probably is. So what do we want to use as like a floor? Well, we want something like a lab workbench, and yeah, a lab workbench could be tiled, but it's more likely to be kind of a sort of a stony effect. Well, that's what I feel anyway. Maybe something like this. View that. Gosh, the internet is slow today. Either that or the site doesn't want me to have it. So we won't view that. We'll view something else. Let's pick something else. What looks good for a lab workbench? Don't want something too fussy like that. We just want something that will reflect and look reasonable as the idea of a workbench. And that would be out of order as well. How about that? Definitely looks stained. So we'll save that. Desktop. Tutorial. Save. And then the next thing I want to do, I want to find a horrible picture of me. How about that? And I'll put that. Pictures. I've got millions of pictures. Not very many of me, I have to admit. Somewhere in here there was a rather manic one. That'll do. So I'm going to save this one. Save as. Bung it in there. Right. Now it's time to fire up Blender. And it doesn't matter if you're using Windows or like me, you're using Linux, because it's all the same. Blender is the same in all these environments pretty much. So we'll just lift the cube up because we're actually going to use the cube for once. Very often we start by deleting it. Today we're not. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a plane, and that's going to be a floor or bench top, as the case may be. And I'm going to scale it up. And we're going to give it a material. Now the way that we do that is we come over here to this circular thing here next to the triangle, and that's our materials tab. And we click plus to add a new material. And if it was just going to be a normal internal material, you'd bother with editing all this lot and changing the colour. It's a good idea to change the colour anyway. Then you can tell it apart from everything else that's in the viewport. That colour isn't going to show, and I'll show you why now. Now I'm going to go onto the textures, which is the tab next door to it. I'm going to add a new texture, and the texture we're going to add is going to be an image or movie, and it's going to be the picture of the lab bench or the garage floor, as the case may be. So desktop, tutorial, and garage floor, that's the one we want. And if we click both, we can see both. If we click the flat bit, we can see what it looks like. So that's the material with the texture applied as we have it. And as you can see, all we've got is that affecting the colour. Now it's a good idea with textures to make it look a bit more real if there's a bit of bumpiness in the surface, and so we're going to make it affect the what's called the normal as well, which makes it look like it's got bumps, but only by a very small amount. Something like 0.1 or 0.2 would be fine. And you can do a trial render, but before we do that we'd better change the lighting. As I've mentioned before, I prefer not to use the light that's there, which starts off as a point light. I find them not very useful. I prefer to use spotlights, especially for indoors. So we're going to make it a spot, and the spotlight lets you control which direction the light is actually coming from. So if we go around to our camera view's there. And actually that's a reasonable direction, but I want to move the spotlight up and to the right a bit, and turn the energy up a bit, make it about 8 or 9 or something like that, if we render that at the moment. So you can see at the moment we've got a shadow there, we've got our cube, and we've got a shadow there. So the first thing I'm going to say is that shadow's got very hard edges, and the way that you get rid of that is you come down to the shadow in the light. So this is the lamp. I've got the lamp selected and I'm changing the lamp properties. And there's this thing called soft size. I'm going to put it up to about 3. We're going to up the samples maybe to about 5, which makes it smoother. Okay. The rest of it we can leave alone, and if we now render image, you can see that is looking a bit more realistic. Okay. Now what you've got down the top edge is the actual edge of the spotlight. And to get rid of that, if you want to get rid of it, you can turn the angle up somewhat and render image again, and you can see we've got rid of that. Okay. Now the background is going to be visible here, you'll notice that I haven't changed the angle of the camera or anything from the default settings. So for your first try, don't worry about that, don't do it, just don't change anything, okay? Just do what I'm showing you, just for your first try, and then you can mess around with it to your heart's content. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to hide this render, so show hide render view. And we'll go back to the camera view again, because that's always very useful, because it lets you see what the camera actually sees. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop in this background. Okay, now to pop in the background we want to install an add-on. I've already got it installed, but if you go to user preferences in the file menu and click on that, click on the add-ons tab, and then you want a thing called images to planes. As you can see, I've already got it. Import, export images, import images as planes, and just click on that box there, and you've got it added just to this scene. If you want it for everything, as I've got, because it's very useful, then just hit save user settings. So having done that, just close that window, go up to file, and under import you'll see you've got images as planes as an option. And what we're going to do is we're going to find our lab background there, in this case, or whatever background you've installed, and you see you've got this little image down here. So if we click on that square, that gives us all of the physical attributes that cube does, and it's called it handily the same name as the image file, which I called lab, so it makes it easy to find. Now under X, click on that and type in 90, which will make it stand up. And then if we click the rotation down here, and we'll rotate it so it's sort of pointing our way, and we'll scale it up. Now to scale up, the easiest way for something like this is just press the S key and move the mouse cursor. And if we come out of there again, and we'll move. Easier to do this sort of thing from the top actually. So you can see which way the camera is pointing, so you know that our background image wants to be like over here someplace. Not a long way over there, but over there somewhere. And it's going to be out of focus, and I'm going to show you how to do that as well. So don't worry so much about the way it looks, it's just there to provide a bit of ambience, as they say. Okay, we'll go back to the camera view, and we want to scale it up so that background image fits all the way through there, and we want to scale it evenly, so S again. There we go. And something like that. That would do well. So this is the background image, and I'm going to tell you now that the best thing to do with objects like this you've got in the background is to go to the Materials tab, and what we want this to be light, but we don't want it to actually have shadows and all this sort of thing. So if you turn up the emit to 1 and make it shadeless, that then just makes it a picture in the background. So if we do a trial render now, you can see you've got all this stuff in the background, and you've got quite a complicated background which is going to look quite good, okay, when it's defocused. And I think I actually want this camera angle to be different, but I don't want to change it because messing around with the camera is not within the purview of this actual tutorial. So we'll get rid of our render view again, and now we want to grab hold of the cube, so we'll select that by right clicking it, drop it down. We don't want it to go through the floor. What we do want to do is to tip it up on one edge. So if we go to our rotation handles, and we'll tip it around so that it winds up on one edge like so. And what I want to do is bring it towards us a bit more, which lets me raise it up off the ground. And that looks like a good place to have it. Now I'm going to rotate it a little more so that the top face is actually bang on towards us, and you'll see why I'm doing that in a minute. So the top face is completely facing us, and that will be the end position of our animation. Okay, and this is where a little bit of cheating comes in, and doing things backwards. So we're going to put, I'm suggesting for this first animation that you just do 160 frames. So we'll go end here, type in 160, and there we go. Now if you go to the end of the animation, which is here, we're going to put in a keyframe, and that keyframe under the animation tab there, we're going to insert, and there's lots of different types that you can insert, and what we want is location and rotation there, and that has frozen that at that frame in that location and that rotation. And as you can see, this blue line here corresponds to the Z axis, and we want it to rotate around the Z axis starting at 0. So if we go back to the beginning, and we'll click on the box to get hold of these settings, and you can see the green here means that at some point a keyframe has been set, and you'll see in a minute this will change to yellow if you set a keyframe actually at the frame you're in. So I want this to spin round a full 360 degrees ish, and so I want it to go that way, which is negative. So minus 42 minus 360 is around about 400 degrees, so that's going to be around about minus 400. Okay, and as you can see, it looks the same but it's not. Now there's another way to set a keyframe, and that is to hover the mouse over what you want to keyframe and press the I key, because here we've already set the location. Actually, it might be a good idea to move it, but I'll show you what happens if you hit the I key. So we hit the I key, it's all gone yellow, and if we go around here and we move the little green bar up, you can see it spin round and round, and that shows you what it's going to do in the animation. The other thing you can do is press play, and that shows you what it'll do in the animation too. So we'll go back to the beginning again. So I think it would be quite nice if it came in from out of focus, which is going to be up here somewhere. So I'm going to move it, and view, I'm going to go to the top view. As I said before, it's easier to move things from the top view, and we're going to move it back here someplace, which just check right where that is. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, view camera. So there it is, and it's in the back there. So we want it to move from there, so we need to set a keyframe as well over that position. So now what it's going to do is it's going to spin and move. So if we pull that along, you see it spins and moves. Now you can see it change size as it comes closer, which is good. However, we can exaggerate that effect that would make it look even better. So if we go once again to the far end, 160, where we've got scale here, and press I. So we set keyframe for the scale, and then when it goes into the distance here, we go back to 0. We're going to make it a smaller scale, so we'll hit S for scale. And that's made it smaller, so we'll hit I over the scale. So now it's going to turn around, but there's something else we need to do, as I'll show you in a minute. You may have noticed already. So there, so the getting larger effect is magnified. It's typical of the sort of thing that you get in cartoons. So we go to the beginning of the animation again. You may have noticed it's now too high because we wanted it just about touching our bench top, so it's there. Okay, that's where we want it. Once more we'll hover our mouse over the location because that's what we just changed. Press I, and it should gracefully pirouette into view like so. Right, we've given everything materials, but we haven't given the cube a material. And what I'm going to make the cube is going to be a mirror. And what's going to happen as it spins around, obviously it will show everything that's around it, but it's going to show the photograph. Okay, because I'm going to put the photograph behind the camera. So let's stop that, and we'll give the cube a material. As you can see, it's already got one. It's got the default material called material. We'll take that out, put a new one in, and leave everything the same except for mirror. So we're going to make this a bit like chrome. So it's going to have very high reflectivity. I don't suggest you put it at 1, maybe 0.874, and we'll make it a little bit blue. And if you had a lot of reflective objects, you'd want to raise this number. You'd want to make it depth 2, but we don't. So we can leave that the same, and we can have nice fast render times. So if we twiddle along until we get it somewhere in the middle, and then do a trial render, and you'll see it'll take a little longer this time because it's a cube, and there you go. Now you may have noticed one other little problem, and that is that everything looks nice apart from this face. Well, that's going to change in a minute, because we're going to put the picture of me, or whatever picture it is you want to use, behind the camera. So show hide render view, and we'll zoom out a bit, and we'll twist around so we can see the camera. And we're going to use import images as planes again. This time it's going to be whatever picture it is you want to show in this image show. Your mum, your pet, Guy the gorilla, whatever. So we've imported it as planes, but whoa, we can't see it. Why is that? That's because whatever you bring into the scene appears where the 3D cursor is. And at the moment the 3D cursor is over here because we were playing around with that. There's no problem. The procedure is just the same as before. We know where it is, so it's rotation 90 in the X, and we want to twist it around so that it's the same sort of angle as that is. And we know we want to scale it up, so we press S and make it bigger. As you can see, we're not quite the right angle, but hey, who cares? And then we want to move it, so we'll go to the top view and we're going to move it so that it's behind the camera. And at the moment it could very well be in the wrong place, it could very well be too small, I think, so I'm going to scale it up a bit more. And it might be in the wrong place vertically, and the way to find out is to go to the end of the animation and we'll do a trial render. You can see, the other thing I haven't done, you can see it needs to go up a bit because that is the top of the picture there. And the other thing I haven't done is I haven't changed the shading on it because it's not shadeless and there's no emit. So I'm going to make it a bit brighter. I'm going to make it 1.2, I'm going to make it shadeless, and if I re-render again without moving anything, you can see now that you can see that picture a bit better than it was. So we'll hide this, and it needs to go up, and it needs to tip as well, because don't forget it's being reflected in the cube, so its angle needs to reflect the angle the cube's at. So we're going to tip it a bit, and now we'll try a trial render again. So that's just my forehead. So in actual fact I got this wrong. It is far too big. And this is typical of the sort of messing around you have to go through to get things to look right in Blender. So let's scale it down again. Hit S, move the mouse in, and I think obviously because it needs to go up again. Render image. As you can see, you've got my head in there, so it needs to go up and across again, and I'm just going to tiddle around like this and re-render until I get it right, and I'll come back to you when I've got it right, because I'm not going to do anything different from what I've just shown you. And we're back in the room. So I've decided this is about how I want it. Now at the moment there's something I don't like about it, and that is that it is perhaps a little too bright, and sometimes emit will do that. So I'm going to turn the emission down to 0.8, re-render it, and I think that's a bit better. Okay, so this is going to be our end result. So once again we're going to be playing with the scale of this, and the reason we're doing that is we only want it to appear like this at the end. Okay, so if I go back to the box, and I'm already at the end of our animation with 160 frames, and I'm going to hit I over the scale. Okay, and I'm going to go back a few frames to maybe 150. I'm going to hit I again. The reason for that is we're going to scale this up in a minute so that it doesn't look much like the picture until it's going to get to around about here, and then suddenly it's going to all fall into place, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So if we go to the front of our animation, oops, somehow we managed to get 160 in there. We go to the front of our animation at frame 0, and now I'm going to scale this right up. It's going to be huge. Huge, huge, huge. I'm going to hit I again, and you can see it's about 30. And we don't want that scale to change much until it gets up here someplace, so I'm going to go a couple of frames before we changed it there, and I'm going to scale it up again to about 30ish. There, that'll do. And hit I again. And as you can see, what that's going to do is it's going to keep the scale pretty constant, and then suddenly we get to there and bang, it scales down just in time to be viewed by our viewer. Okay, so if we go into that and we'll move this back, do a quick test render, and there we go. Now what we're going to do is, I don't like the fact that that is grey, and what that's doing is it's showing the normal world background. So I'm going to change that by clicking on the little world symbol here, and you see you've got all these different colours you can set for the horizon, which is obviously there, and the zenith, which is at the top. I'm going to make those white because there's a lot of white in this lab. You make it whatever colour you think is going to suit your scene. So now if I render, you'll see that that's come out white, but maybe it's a bit too white. Maybe I actually want a very light grey, so maybe we're going to tone it down 0.638 there, so there's something like that, and there we are. Now I said I was going to change the focus, and this is going to be your first little dip into compositing. So let's show the hide the render image, and we're going to go back to the beginning of the scene. So that's where it is at the beginning, and at the end of the scene is we want it to focus really bang on that face. Okay, and a good way of doing that is I'm going to select the cube, go down to object, we've got the snap tools here. I want to snap a 3D cursor to the selected object. So I'm going to focus on that 3D cursor, but that could move anywhere. So I'm going to put something called an empty in there, and all an empty is just like an imaginary thing that never renders, and you can use them to keep the positions of things and to focus on, and to use it any way you need, like an invisible object that controls something else. So we're going to go down to here to create, and we've got empty there, create our empty, and the empty is just going to look like a cross. If I move the 3D cursor away by left clicking, see the empty's there, but it's inside the cube, so you can't really see it, but it's called empty. A better name for it, if I right click on that and hit rename, better name for it might be focus, so we'll call it focus. So if we go to our camera and select our camera, which you can do either in the list up there, or you can do it by finding the camera which is there and right clicking it, and we'll go to the little picture of a camera, which is all the settings that you need. We're going to go to camera presets, and I like using that one. You can play around, use other ones. Canon 1100D is quite good, and we want it to focus on that empty, and we called it focus. Surprise, surprise. And you can also focus on a distance, but that's less controllable. Okay, so that is our focus. And if I now go into this little menu up here, you can see there's one called Compositing, and I'm going to click on that, and that gives you a 3D view, it gives you the render view, and it gives you a compositing view. Now where we want to be on actually on the beginning frame, of our animation, because we want to check. Oh, by the way, you can move these things about. So maybe going back to the default view, which is the one we were in, go back to the beginning frame, go back to the camera view, and we can see our little object up there as it's just about to spin into view. And we want to make sure this is out of focus and the background is out of focus. So we'll go to Compositing, click this one which says use nodes, that's very important. And what we want to do is we want to add a viewer, so add, and you want the output group, we want the viewer. The viewer is going to go in there, and that lets us see what's going on as a backdrop, and we're going to click this backdrop there. So as you can see, that's taken the rendered view that we had, and we want to re-render it, and it will appear down here. I cannot for the life of me remember how to use the scale. There we go. That's the backdrop in that right hand menu there, because we want to see all of it. Okay, we want to make sure this background here is out of focus and this is out of focus. The way we do that is we add in what's called a defocus node. Under filter, defocus, there. So click on that and move our mouse, and here comes our defocus mode. And we want to take that image, we want to put the image into the image, we want to put the Z into Z, we want to tick use Z buffer. We'll take the image off those two, and the image is now going to come from that one, which is our output. Okay, so what we've got here is f-stop. Now f-stop 128, that gives you a perfect depth of field. We don't want that, so we're going to turn this right the way down. And as you can see, the background here is starting to blur out. We want it to blur a bit more than that, so we're going to take it down further until we think it looks right. So the cube is going to spin, and somewhere around about here it's going to start to come into focus. I think that's a bit too aggressive with the blurring. So there we are, and that will do us. Now the next thing we want to do is render the actual animation. So if we go back to the default view again, we need to set a few things up. Now there's a lot of discussion about rendering and whether you should render as a video or as frames or as whatever. I nearly always render straight to video, unless I need to do some work in Photoshop on individual frames. So we're going to do that, and I'll show you how to do it. First thing to do is to set up where it's going to go. I'm going to stick it on my desktop. So there we go. So accept that. I'm going to bung a file name on the end of it, and I'm going to call it just TUT for tutorial, and that will just make sure that it doesn't get confused with anything else that I've got on the desktop. And then here where it says PNG, that stands for Portable Network Graphics. We don't want that, we want Xvideo. So that's there, which is the smallest video type of video file. So that's set up what it is and where it's going to be. Now the next thing is, what size do you want it? Well, we've got some render presets here, and there's lots of different ones. You can have it super duper, or you can have it really crap. We're going to pick something in the middle. HD TV 720 pixels, that'll be fine, which is 1280 by 720. So we will then go to render and render animation, and it's going to take a little while. I'll tell you how long in a minute. I'm going to pause you while it renders. And here we are again. So this animation took around about 12 minutes to render, which isn't too bad, and I've known some animations take a day or more to render. So let's just go into render. We'll see play rendered animation, and that will give us a window. We can see what we've got. Now, if I was going to do this as a finished project, I'd be looking at presenting the photo in a different manner, because at the moment it's snapping down into the right size at a time when it's in view. And it's a good idea probably to do that beforehand, so I would actually move the keyframes, but yeah, it's not bad for your first go. Now, don't worry about things like materials and compositing, just do what I did, and I'll be covering materials and compositing in some later tutorials. Well, thanks very much. If you enjoyed this, have a go and like and subscribe.